When my father laughed that night, something in me cracked. He raised his glass and said, "At least the army paid her rent while she played doctor." Everyone laughed with him except me. I'm Ethel Robinson, and that was the night my father taught me what humiliation feels like, and the night I silently promised he'd one day learn what honor really means. The laughter hit harder than any explosion I'd heard overseas. It echoed off the marble walls of the Hyatt ballroom, rich and rehearsed, the kind that fills a room because people think they're supposed to laugh. Behind the curtain, I could smell the champagne, the perfume, the money. It was the scent of people who'd never known dirt under their fingernails, never patched a wound that wasn't their own. He was in the center of it all, as always, sharp suit glass, raised the man who never needed a microphone because the world already listened when he spoke. His voice slid through the air, steady, and practiced a weapon wrapped in charm. At least the army paid her rent while she played doctor. Polite laughter rippled again. Forks chimed against crystal heels, clicked on marble. I froze where I was, my fingers tightening around a paper cup until it cracked down the side. The warmth of the coffee bled through a dark streak across my palm. He was still talking, spinning the same story he'd told for years about his foolish daughter, who walked away from privilege for a uniform. He loved to turn my choices into anecdotes, each punchline polished until it gleamed. The room adored him for it. They always did. For a moment, I almost turned to leave. It would have been easier to walk out, disappear back into the quiet, where his voice couldn't reach me. But something in that laughter, the sound of strangers agreeing, I wasn't enough, rooted me in place. The host's voice sliced through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Ethel Robinson, U.S. Army Medical Corps veteran." The room stilled. Every head turned. I saw the smile die on his face, caught mid-gesture glass hovering halfway to his lips. For the first time, Harold Robinson, the man who built empires, looked unsure. I stepped from behind the curtain. The click of my heels on the marble floor filled the silence. Each step felt like years condensed into sound. I wasn't wearing sequins or silk. Just the white of my coat pressed and clean, the silver pins at my chest catching the light. I walked past tables lined with donors and executives, past cameras that tilted to follow me. When I reached the stage, I turned to him. He stood near the front, still holding that glass red wine trembling at the rim. "Good evening." My voice carried through the hall, calm and steady. Some of us still believe service isn't a punchline. Silence settled heavy and absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. I let the words hang there, short, deliberate, undeniable. Then I nodded to the host, stepped back from the microphone, and left the stage. My pulse was steady, my face still. Behind me, I heard nothing. No clapping, no laughter. Just the faint clink of glass as his hand shook and the wine spilled down his cuff. I didn't look back. The air outside the ballroom was colder, cleaner. The piano music faded as the doors closed behind me. I hadn't come to embarrass him. I'd come to remind him some things can't be bought no matter how much you try. And tonight, that thing was me. Somewhere far away, beneath the hum of the city, a different sound stirred, memory, sharp as broken glass, pulling me back to the house on Cypress Hill, 20 years earlier, where everything had begun. Houston, 2004. I was 17, and the house on Cypress Hill had 12 bedrooms, 3 floors, and not a single corner warm enough for an honest conversation. The walls carried more echoes of stock prices than laughter. Even dinner sounded like a board meeting. My father sat at the head of a long mahogany table, reading quarterly numbers off a report, while I stared at my plate, imagining another life somewhere far beyond the marble and glass. He believed words like service and sacrifice belonged to other families. In his world, power was the only proof of worth. He liked to say, doctors fix broken people, but leaders build empires, and I was born to lead. I'd nod because arguing was useless, but in my mind I saw my mother's face, the one fading from our photo frames faster than from memory. Cancer had taken her quietly, without a fight, and no one in the family had said goodbye. Not properly. I decided then I would learn how to stop that kind of silence. I would save lives even if they weren't ours. The day the acceptance letter came from the Army Medical Academy in San Antonio, I hid it in my journal, pressed between old photos of my mother and a dried wildflower I'd picked from her grave. It was my secret, my rebellion, my promise. For 2 weeks, I lived in that fragile bubble of hope until he found it. It happened in the kitchen, early morning light, spilling across the counter like a spotlight. He was holding the letter open in one hand, the other gripping his coffee cup. When our eyes met, his jaw tightened. The cup slipped shattered on the tile, dark liquid bleeding out like oil. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His calm was the kind that made you want to shrink. "You'll come back begging in 6 months." He said, his tone sharp and almost amused. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote something quickly. When he finished, he tore the paper loose and slid it across the table toward me. "That's your last check, Ethel." The number didn't matter. The insult did. I stared at it for a moment, then tore the check clean down the middle. I didn't flinch when he turned away. Upstairs, I packed a suitcase in silence. Lydia, my stepmother, stood by the staircase, her hands twisting the fabric of her robe. She tried to smile, but her eyes were glassy. "He's not angry. He's afraid," she whispered. I stopped halfway down the stairs, looking at her. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control. I carried the suitcase out through the front door without looking back. The air outside was heavy with the smell of rain, and for a moment, the house behind me glowed with that soft golden light that always made it look perfect from a distance, beautiful but cruel in its silence. When the bus pulled away from the Houston terminal that night, I sat by the window and watched the house shrink into the horizon, the lights flickering between the trees until they disappeared completely. My reflection stared back at me from the glass eyes, red but steady. If he thought I was weak, he was about to learn what strength really looked like. The air over Kandahar burned like open flame. 122 degrees, and the sky shimmered the way metal does before it melts. The inside of the medevac helicopter was an oven wrapped in noise, the whine of rotors, the smell of diesel, the crackle of the radio spitting out chaos. Convoy hit, multiple casualties. We dropped fast the desert, rushing up at us, endless and blinding. Sand slammed against the windows like fists. When the skids touched down, heat and dust swallowed us whole. I jumped out, first boots sinking into a sea of grit, goggles fogging. The air smelled of smoke gunpowder and blood so thick it never really left your skin. I can still taste it sometimes, even now. Miller was right behind me, his voice cutting through the static. He was laughing, always laughing, like war was some bad joke he refused to take seriously. He tossed me a bottle of warm water. "You're tougher than most men here, Doc." I caught it, rolled my eyes, and kept moving. We both knew humor was the last line of defense we had left. We reached the convoy, 3 Humvees ripped apart, black smoke twisting into the sun. Screams mixed with the clatter of metal radio calls snapping in my ear. I went to work on instinct, hands steady, though the world shook around me. Tourniquet, pressure, morphine. Keep breathing. Keep them alive. The second explosion came without warning. The blast knocked me off my feet, sand filling my mouth and eyes. When the ringing stopped, I couldn't hear anything but my heartbeat. I blinked through the dust and saw Miller lying near the truck, his chest slick with red. I crawled to him, knees tearing through the gravel. My hands pressed down hard over the wound, but the blood kept coming bubbling up between my fingers. "Stay with me," I said, or maybe screamed, I can't remember. His breathing hitched, his eyes locking on mine. His lips moved, voice barely a whisper over the chaos. "Tell your father." He raised a fighter. Then his hand went slack. The silence after was louder than the explosions. I sat there in the middle of the desert, the heat pressing against me, his blood drying on my gloves. Around us, the wind carried the sound of engines fading, and men shouting orders I couldn't hear. For a long time, I just stared at him. That night, I wrote to my father. The letter was short, the words clipped, because anything more would have broken me. Today, I lost a man braver than both of us combined. I folded it carefully, sealed it, and sent it through the military mail. A week passed, then another. No reply. I wrote again. Nothing. By the third letter, I stopped expecting an answer. Some silences are so complete they start to sound like truth. A few days later, one of the soldiers from Miller's unit found me outside the medical tent. He didn't say much, just held out his hand and placed something cold and heavy into mine, a medic badge edges crusted with dried blood. He said Miller wanted you to have it, said you'd know what to do with it. The metal felt heavier than it should have. I turned it over in my palm, tracing the scratches with my thumb. It wasn't just his blood on it. It was everything I hadn't said, everything I'd lost. I slipped it into my pocket and kept it there. I've kept it ever since. It's followed me through every deployment, every hospital, every silence that's come after. It's colder now, but it still carries his weight. Years later, I can still feel the desert when I touch it. The heat, the grit, the smell of smoke. It's strange how memory hides in small things waiting. I blink, and the sound of the helicopter fades. The ballroom comes back into focus, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. The weight in my pocket is the same badge scarred and dull from time. I run my thumb across it, feeling the ridges like old wounds. He's somewhere in the same city, laughing over wine and numbers measuring life and profit margins. I smile small and sharp. He laughs over money. I laugh because I still have a heart. The applause from that night still rang in my head, dull and distant, like a wound that refused to close. Weeks after the gala, I tried to bury myself in the rhythm of hospital life charts. Patience, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. But some silences follow you like shadows. Denver had been a reminder of how far I'd come and how far my father would go to pretend none of it mattered. It started with a news clip playing on the break room TV. Robinson Energy sponsors Veterans Health Initiative. The headline read. The image beneath it froze me in place, my face in uniform bent over a wounded soldier. The same photo a journalist had taken years ago in Kandahar Miller's blood still visible on my sleeve. Now it had been turned into a company slogan about patriotism and family legacy. The coffee in my hand went cold. Someone behind me said my name, but I didn't answer. I just stood there watching the screen until the ad ended, my stomach twisting with something I couldn't name. Rage, betrayal, disbelief. Maybe all of them at once. I called his office that afternoon. No one answered. I called again, then again, until Lydia's voice finally came through the line, calm and rehearsed. He's in meetings all day, Ethel. He's proud of you, you know. He's showing people what you've accomplished. That word proud hit like a bruise. My father had never been proud of anything he didn't own. 3 days later, I drove to Houston. The building was all glass and sharp edges, a monument to everything he believed in. When I walked into his office, he didn't even look surprised. He just leaned back in his chair, perfectly composed, and gestured toward the TV where the same ad was playing on a loop. It helps people remember we stand for service, he said. I stared at him, feeling that old heat in my chest. You stand for profit, I told him. You turned a dead man's blood into marketing. He lifted an eyebrow unmoved. If my name can get donations for veteran hospitals, why shouldn't yours? For a moment, I couldn't find words. The same man who once told me medicine was a waste of time was now using it as his brand. I left before the anger could spill out. That night, I drove straight back to Colorado. The highway stretched black and endless ahead of me, a strip of asphalt lit only by the beams of passing trucks. Somewhere between Houston and home, I promised myself I wouldn't let his lies stand any longer. The next morning, a patient came into the ER, Mike Harris, 42 Army veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan. His skin was pale, his eyes yellowed from liver failure. He smiled weakly when I introduced myself. Heard you were one of us, Doc. The blood tests came back the next day, aggressive cancer advanced stage. I asked about his home, his water, what he'd been drinking. He said Red Creek well water. I froze. I ran the tests twice. The contaminants were there, industrial solvents, high levels of benzene. It was the same compound Robinson Energy used in one of their refining plants just outside Red Creek. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, the lab report spread in front of me, staring at the letterhead that bore my father's company name. The next morning, I filed a request for environmental review through official channels. 2 days later, I got an anonymous email. Stop digging before you bury yourself. Attached was a single scanned page from an internal report my father's signature scrawled at the bottom. I printed the page and held it under the lamp. The ink had bled slightly, the strokes uneven, but it was his handwriting. Approval granted for temporary waste disposal, Red Creek Basin. I could almost hear his voice, calm and detached, calling it a minor cost of doing business. The air in my office felt thinner. I thought of Mike Harris lying in a hospital bed, of Miller bleeding out in the desert, of all the men who gave more than they had. My father's empire was poisoning them, long after the fighting had ended. I called Lydia again. She answered on the second ring, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knows you've seen it. He said to tell you. He said we'd do enough good to balance it out." I hung up. The words "enough good" scraped against my mind like glass. That evening, as I left the hospital, an envelope was waiting on my windshield. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A formal invitation embossed in gold. Veterans Care Gala, honoring corporate heroes. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was a note from Lydia. "He doesn't know you're coming." I laughed, short and bitter. It felt like fate, cruel and precise. I spent the next few days preparing my speech, not for the crowd, but for him. Every sentence was a blade I'd kept sharpened for years. But the closer the event came, the more I felt the weight of what I was about to do. Revenge is simple until you remember the face behind it. The night before the gala, I visited Mike Harris one last time. He was fading fast, but when he saw me, he smiled. "Don't let them forget us," he said. "Not all battles end overseas." When I left his room, I found myself standing outside under the hospital's dim parking lot light, staring at the sky. Somewhere out there was a man who thought he could buy forgiveness, who built his fortune on silence and smoke. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and touched the medic badge I'd carried since Kandahar. The metal was cold, the edges rough against my fingers. For years it had reminded me of pain, of loss, of everything I couldn't fix. But that night, it felt different, steady, grounding. He would be there tomorrow, smiling for cameras, pretending service was something that could be measured in donations and headlines. And I would walk into that room and remind him what it truly cost. The wind off the Rockies cut through my coat as I whispered to no one, just to the night itself. "You taught me how to fight, Dad. You just never asked who I was fighting for." The streetlight flickered once, then went out. I turned toward the hospital doors, the badge still warm in my hand, and waited for morning. The applause felt hollow. It echoed through the grand auditorium like the sound of rain against metal, meant to comfort but too cold to reach me. I stood on the stage beneath the bright white lights, the stiff collar of my dress uniform pressing against my throat. The silver medical insignia on my chest caught every flash from the photographers, but all I could see was the empty seat in the front row. The brass plate on the chair read Harold Robinson, my father's name, the one that carried weight everywhere but here. When the ceremony ended, I smiled. For the cameras shook hands with generals and accepted the medal I had earned with more blood than anyone in the room could imagine. The ribbon felt heavy, as if it already knew what was missing. Outside, a staff member handed me an envelope, plain white, no return address. Inside was a postcard. "Still think medicine pays rent. Dad? No congratulations, no signature." Just the same tired joke he'd made since I was 18, now printed on silence thick enough to choke on. The metal clinked softly as I folded the postcard and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't cry. The tears had burned out long ago, somewhere between the sandstorms of Kandahar and the quiet nights in Texas, where his absence spoke louder than words. Months passed. The medal found a home in the back of a drawer, and I returned to the rhythm of the ER adrenaline exhaustion paperwork repeat. Until one night during a rare quiet shift, a nurse turned the TV toward me. "Hey, isn't that you?" I looked up. "Robinson Energy, we support veterans." The screen showed a photograph I knew too well. Me in full uniform, bent over a wounded soldier, hand pressed to his chest, dust in the air, blood on my gloves. The same moment when Sergeant Miller had died. The tagline crawled across the bottom of the screen. "Our CEO's daughter, a proud veteran, proof that Robinson Energy stands with America's heroes." I froze. The hum of the hospital monitors faded into nothing. My pulse roared in my ears. That image, that memory, that pain, he'd turned it into marketing, into profit, into a banner for a man who hadn't spoken to me in years. I drove home that night on autopilot. The road blurred neon lights streaking across the windshield like open wounds. By morning, I was dialing his office. No one picked up. The next day, Lydia called. Her voice was the same mix of apology and rehearsal it had always been. Ethel, please don't misunderstand. It's just a campaign. People like seeing that we're a family. It makes the company look united. Family. I almost laughed. The words sounded foreign in her mouth. 2 days later, I got in my car and drove 9 hours to Houston through rain fog and the kind of silence that only comes from long roads and long grudges. His building rose like a mirror to the sky steel glass-perfect lines. I took the elevator to the 52nd floor and walked into his office without knocking. He didn't even look surprised, just glanced up from his laptop and leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Behind him, the skyline glittered in the afternoon light. He gestured to the TV on the wall, where the ad played again. The sound was muted, but the image spoke loudly enough. If my name helps your hospital get donations, I'm fine with it. You should feel the same. I stared at him. He had the same calm that used to intimidate boardrooms and reporters. A stillness so controlled it became arrogance. My voice came out low, even sharper than I intended. If your name ever helped anyone breathe again, I would. The smile vanished. He turned his back, looking out at the city below. His reflection on the glass was cold and distant. You're emotional, he said finally. That's your mother in you. And what's in you, Dad, prophet? For the first time, he said nothing, not a word, just stood there, his shoulders stiff, his silence heavier than any insult. I walked out before the quiet could crush me. By the time I reached my car, the sun had set, leaving the city pulsing with the red and blue of streetlights and billboards. I sat behind the wheel, the medal still in my pocket from the ceremony months before. I turned on the radio to fill the void. A newscaster's voice floated through the static. Robinson Energy announced today its sponsorship of the upcoming Veterans Care Gala, where CEO Harold Robinson will be honored for his ongoing support of America's heroes. I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach your eyes. The irony stung more than the joke on his postcard. He'd never supported a soldier in his life, not even the one he raised. Outside, the neon lights of Houston glowed against the windshield reflections of wealth and power, and everything he thought mattered. They shimmered and broke apart in the rain, twisting into something unrecognizable, something that looked almost like regret. I put the car in gear, and the city faded behind me, leaving only the hum of the engine and the weight of the metal in my lap, cold against my palm, shining dully in the dark. The night shift in Colorado Springs always felt longer in the fall. The mountain air seeped through at the cracks of the hospital windows, cold and sharp enough to remind me that I was still alive. It was nearly midnight when the paramedics wheeled in a man whose skin looked more gray than flesh. His chart read, Harris Mike, 42, Army veteran. He tried to joke with the nurse as they pushed him in, but his voice came out hoarse, broken at the edges. I took his hand. It was calloused and warm, like someone who'd held on to too many things for too long. He looked up at me, eyes clouded with fatigue. Doc, they say it's the water. Red Creek's poisoned. I squeezed his hand gently, telling him we'd do everything we could, but the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. His pulse was weak, his liver failing. He was dying, and I already knew it. When the results came back, I read them twice, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. His blood work showed toxin levels off the chart, industrial solvents, benzene compounds, things that had no business being in a man's body. I ran another test on a sample of his well water. The match was undeniable. The same chemicals used by Robinson Energy in their Texas facilities. For a long time, I just stared at the printout my name and the companies printed on opposite corners of the same page. It felt like the universe was laughing. I filled out an internal request for an environmental review and sent it through official channels. It was the kind of thing that took months, sometimes years, to move. But 3 days later, an anonymous email arrived in my inbox. No message, just a single attachment. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a scan of an internal document. The header read, Waste Disposal Authorization, Temporary Exception. At the bottom, in the unmistakable black ink of my father's fountain pen, was his signature, approved, Harold Robinson. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the air leave the room. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear, but from something worse, recognition. I could hear his voice, calm, dismissive, rationalizing everything with the precision of a businessman. It's temporary. It's efficient. It's just business. I called Lydia. She picked up on the second ring, her tone soft but guarded. He's dying, I said quietly. Did he know silence? Then her breath caught. Ethel, please don't make this harder than it already is. He told me. He said, we donate to veterans. That's enough. That's enough. The phrase landed like a stone in my chest. Enough for him meant a check, a speech, a gala. Enough meant buying redemption one donation at a time. I hung up before she could say anything else. That night, I stood in the operating room long after my last patient had gone. The white light of the surgical lamps washed everything sterile. No shadows, no warmth, no excuses. My reflection on the glass cabinet looked unfamiliar. Hair tied tight, eyes hollow. The faint line of a scar cutting through my left eyebrow. I thought of my oath. I'd sworn to protect life, not legacies. I'd promised to save people, not reputations. I turned back to my desk, opened the document again, and copied every file, every page, every signature. Then I uploaded it to the Environmental Bureau's whistleblower system. My hands were steady, but my heart felt like it was walking a wire between duty and destruction. By morning, the sun had barely risen when I found a cream-colored envelope on my desk. Heavy paper, expensive ink. Inside was an invitation embossed with Gold Veterans Care, Gala, Denver, Colorado. My name stood out in bold type. Dr. Ethel Robinson, keynote speaker. For a moment, I thought it was a cruel joke. Then I saw the sender's name, Lydia Robinson. A note in her handwriting was scrawled beneath the printed text. He doesn't know you're coming. I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Half amusement, half disbelief. It felt like fate had a twisted sense of humor. The man who had mocked my choices, who had turned my pain into advertising, would now sit in an audience as I spoke about service, sacrifice, and truth. He would hear my voice echo across a ballroom filled with his friends and investors, and he wouldn't be able to stop it. That night, I stood outside the hospital under the flickering porch light. The air was cold enough to bite through my coat. I reached into my pocket and took out Miller's medic badge, the one I'd carried since Kandahar. The metal was scratched and worn smooth from years of being held, but under the harsh glow, it still caught the light. I turned it over in my hand, feeling its weight. I remembered his laugh, the way he'd teased me for taking things too seriously, the way he'd looked at me before the end. Tell your father he raised a fighter. I whispered into the dark, the words barely visible in the cold air. You were right, Miller. He did raise a fighter. He just never realized she was fighting him. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain from the mountains. Somewhere behind me, the hospital lights flickered, then steadied again. I slipped the badge back into my pocket, straightened my shoulders, and looked toward Denver, where another kind of battle waited. This one wouldn't leave blood on the ground, but it would cut just as deep. Denver glittered that night like it wanted to outshine the truth. The Grand Hyatt ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers shaped like frozen rain, every crystal a prism for laughter, wealth, and lies. Waiters moved like choreography trays of champagne gliding between tuxedos and sequined gowns. The smell of perfume and politics clung to the air, sweet, heavy, suffocating. I stood at the edge of it all, hidden in plain sight. My white coat had been traded for a formal uniform, simple, pressed, unassuming. To everyone else, I was just part of the escort detail, another veteran invited to make the evening look respectable. No one knew the irony that I was the daughter of the man being honored as Patriot of the Year. When the orchestra's melody faded, the host stepped up to the podium, voice swelling with pride. Please welcome Mr. Harold Robinson. The applause was thunder. My father walked into it like a general returning from war, his posture crisp, his confidence unshaken. The flash of cameras chased him across the stage. He looked untouchable, every inch the man the city worshipped. He began to speak, and the words poured out smooth, measured, practiced. "Service is the backbone of America," he declared. The room nodded rapt, their eyes reflecting his light. He spoke of sacrifice unity and the brave men and women who had given their lives for this country. For a moment, even I wanted to believe him. Then he smiled, that same sharp, knowing smile I'd grown up with. And he couldn't help himself. Even my daughter once thought uniforms made her noble. A ripple of polite laughter drifted through the room, soft but poisonous. My hands clenched around the medic badge in my pocket until the edges bit into my skin. Before I could move, another voice rose from the front row. Funny because she saved my son in Iraq. Every head turned. Senator Douglas stood, his eyes cutting through the crowd and landing squarely on me. He gave a small nod toward the stage. "Dr. Robinson, would you join us?" For a heartbeat, I didn't move. The sound of my pulse drowned out everything, the music, the murmurs, even my own thoughts. Then I stepped forward. Each click of my heels against the marble floor sounded like a countdown. The lights followed me as I crossed the room. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, their whispers circling like wind. I reached the stage and stopped beside the man who had built empires out of oil and ego. The applause had died. The silence was a living thing. I met his eyes. They were wide, startled, almost human. For the first time in years, he didn't have a line ready. I turned to the microphone. "Service isn't about being seen. It's about showing up when others walk away." The words echoed into the stillness, calm and clean. I spoke of soldiers who never came home, of medics who worked by flashlight in the dust of names no one bothered to remember. I spoke of sacrifice without cameras, of service without applause. As I spoke, the lights brightened, catching both of us in their glare. His reflection stared back at me from the mirrored walls, his suit immaculate, his face pale. "My father taught me business," I said, my voice steady, "but my country taught me honor." For a second, there was nothing. No sound, no motion, just a breath held by 100 strangers. Then applause exploded. A tidal wave of sound crashed through the room. People rose to their feet. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed like lightning. I didn't smile. I simply looked at him one last time. In his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before, fear. Not of me, not even of exposure, but of the reflection he couldn't escape. I stepped down from the stage, leaving the microphone humming in my wake. The noise followed me, a storm of clapping and cheers that felt both distant and deafening. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I turned just enough to see him standing alone under the chandelier. The stem of his wine glass, broken red liquid, spreading across the floor like a slow, deliberate wound. Cameras clicked furiously. The flashes caught his expression, the confusion, the crack in the armor. The once invincible Harold Robinson, frozen in place, surrounded by the glitter of his own downfall. I kept walking. Outside the ballroom, the air was colder, sharper, real. Lydia caught up to me near the exit, her heels tapping against the marble, her voice trembling. "Ethel, the press is losing their minds. They want a statement. She stopped herself, lowering her voice. "He's not well." "I've never seen him like that." I turned toward her, the reflection of the chandelier lights still glimmering on the glass doors. "Sometimes to rebuild something, you have to let it fall apart first." Her eyes softened, a mix of guilt and relief. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she truly understood. I pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The night air cut across my face, crisp and cold. Behind me, laughter and panic tangled inside the ballroom like smoke. The city lights shimmered on the glass facade of the hotel, scattering across the surface like 1,000 fractured truths. For years, I had carried his silence like a wound. Tonight, I had handed it back to him, wrapped in applause sharp as a mirror. As I walked away, I caught my reflection in the glass wall, small, steady, and whole. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the child of Harold Robinson. I felt like someone who had stopped running. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of shattering glass from inside. I didn't turn back. Some things are meant to break before they can be rebuilt. The city lights glittered like fallen stars across the wet pavement, and for a fleeting moment, I thought they looked almost like hope. Rain came down hard over Denver, washing the city in silver streaks that glittered under the streetlights. But no storm could rinse away the headlines splashed across every screen. every feed, every whisper in the early hours of the morning. Harold Robinson humiliated at Veterans Gala. The city loved a scandal, especially when it came wrapped in wealth and legacy. It was 2 a.m. in the ER. The night shift was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels too fragile to last. Then the doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. A nurse shouted over the noise of the storm outside. Male 67 cardiac arrest. Name's Harold Robinson. For a split second, I thought I'd misheard her. Then I saw the face. Pale, drawn eyes half open. My father. The world tilted. The sterile light above me blurred into white noise. I stood frozen for a heartbeat too long before instinct took over. They were already wheeling him toward Trauma Room 2, monitors screaming in broken rhythm. I moved with them. Gloves on. Focus! He wasn't a father. He wasn't a headline. He was a patient. The nurse hesitated, glancing at me. Should we call another doctor? There wasn't time. I was the only attending on duty. We started compressions. Charge to 200. Clear. His body arched under the shock, the smell of ozone filling the air. Again. The monitor flatlined, then flickered. Another jolt. Another pause. Then a sound. A faint, stuttering beep. The smallest proof of life. He was back. The tension left my shoulders all at once. I pulled the mask down just enough to catch my breath. Sweat mixed with the sting of tears I didn't have time to feel. His eyelids fluttered. When he finally focused, his gaze landed on me. There was no command in his eyes now, no authority, just confusion and something softer. You healed what I broke, he whispered, his voice gravel in air. I looked away, blinking hard. Just doing my job, sir. Hours passed. The storm outside slowed to a mist, and the hospital fell into that fragile stillness that always follows chaos. I stood in the hallway, outside his room, the buzz of the monitors muffled by the door. For the first time in 20 years, he was lying in a bed I could stand beside without fear. When I finally went in, he was awake. Propped up against the pillows, oxygen cannula resting under his nose, skin pale but alive. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, fragile, in a way power had never allowed him to be. I watched the rise and fall of his chest for a moment before stepping closer. He turned his head slowly, meeting my eyes. I watched the broadcast, he said quietly. Every word. I deserved it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like victory, and I didn't want to win anymore. You were right about service, he went on, his voice breaking. I spent my life earning. You spent yours giving. The room was still except for the faint hum of the heart monitor marking every beat like a countdown. 20 years of silence sat between us, heavy, but not unbridgeable. He reached for my hand. The skin of his palm was thin, papery, but the grip was steady. Help me fix it, Ethel, before I can't. Fix what? The damage I caused. The water. The men who drank it. His voice cracked on the last word. The air in the room thickened until I could barely breathe. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The man who once defined strength by dominance now looked at me as if I were the only person who could grant him peace. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to remind him of every bruise his words had left, every silence that had cut deeper than a blade. But standing there, I couldn't. What I saw wasn't the man who'd ruined so much, it was the father who finally realized what he'd lost. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The city outside the window glowed in that strange, washed-out light that comes after a storm. Lydia arrived carrying a folder thick with documents. Her eyes were swollen, the careful elegance she always wore now unraveling at the edges. He wanted you to have this, she said. Inside were reports, contracts, environmental audits, memos stamped confidential, the kind of papers that could sink a company and a reputation at once. On the final page was his signature. Beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, a single line. To be corrected under Ethel Robinson's supervision. My throat tightened. It wasn't an excuse or a justification. It was an admission, a surrender. His way of saying sorry without saying it out loud. I looked up from the papers. He was asleep, chest rising and falling in a rhythm steadier than it had been the night before. The lines of his face were softer now, the sharp edges dulled by exhaustion. Lydia sat silently by the window, staring out at the city. When he woke again, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the room gold. He smiled faintly when he saw me still standing there. His eyes, once sharp, unyielding, were warm, unguarded. "You taught me to fight," I said quietly. "You just never asked what I was fighting for." He exhaled slow and even. A tear slipped down the side of his face, catching the light as it fell. His lips parted into a smile, small but real. For the first time, I saw peace there. Not the kind that comes from victory, but from surrender. He closed his eyes again, and the room filled with the soft hum of machines and the muted glow of morning. Outside Denver stirred awake. The last of the rain evaporated off the streets, leaving behind the scent of earth and renewal. Inside, I stood at the foot of his bed, the folder of his confessions pressed against my chest, and felt the faintest tremor of something I hadn't known in years, something dangerously close to forgiveness. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the light from the window spilled across the floor, warm and golden. The nurse at the desk glanced up, and I nodded, unable to speak. Down the corridor, the rhythmic beeping of his monitor followed me like an echo, steady, deliberate, alive. For the first time, that sound didn't remind me of war. It reminded me of hope. 3 days had passed since the gala, but the noise of it still lingered in my mind. The applause, the glass breaking, the look in his eyes when the lights turned on him. Yet the hospital was silent now. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I stood outside his room for a long moment before entering the thick folder clutched under my arm. He had asked for it himself, insisted on seeing every report, every signature, every consequence. When I finally stepped inside the room, smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and the faint hum of machines blended with his shallow breathing. He looked smaller somehow. His skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp bones, his hair grayer than I remembered. But his eyes, clearer, steadier, held a light I hadn't seen in years. I pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, the folder resting in my lap. He opened his mouth, his voice rough but deliberate. "I watched your speech. You spoke better than any politician I've met." I kept my tone calm, almost detached. "I didn't say your name, Dad. You didn't have to. The truth wears my face." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The morning sun leaked through the blinds, slicing the room into narrow bands of gold and shadow. His breathing filled the silence, steady but fragile. Finally, he gestured toward the folder in my hands. "Open it," he whispered. Inside were documents, hundreds of pages of what I'd only glimpsed before: disposal permits, chemical transport invoices, water reports marked confidential. Each line was an echo of damage done, every signature a scar carved into the land. At the bottom of the last page was a note scrawled in uneven handwriting. "To be corrected under the supervision of Dr. Ethel Robinson." I looked up. "You're turning yourself in." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "No, I'm turning myself around." I felt the air catch in my throat. For all his pride, all the years he'd spent building walls of power and money, that sentence was the first thing he'd ever said that sounded like surrender. He looked toward the window where dawn was beginning to bloom, the light faint but relentless. He took a slow breath before continuing. "I've already called the lawyers. Every asset I have, every cent, will fund a new project, clean water for veterans. You'll oversee it." I stared at him, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who won't lie to me or for me." His voice was softer now, frayed around the edges, but there was clarity in it. The same clarity I'd once seen in soldiers who knew they wouldn't survive the night, but still gave orders with calm conviction. The oxygen tube reflected a thin strip of silver light across his face, and for the first time, I didn't see the man who had ruled through fear. I saw a man stripped bare, no empire, no armor, just a father trying at last to make something right. I leaned back in the chair, folding my arms across the folder. "You taught me to fight," I said quietly. "You just never asked what I was fighting for." He turned his head toward me, his eyes soft with something that looked like peace. "And now I know," he murmured. "You were fighting for both of us." We sat there for a long time, neither of us moving. The rhythmic beep of the monitor filled the silence, steady as a heartbeat grounding us both. No pride, no anger, Just two people, one learning forgiveness, the other learning how to ask for it. I don't know how long I stayed, minutes or hours. It didn't matter. For once, time wasn't something to fight against. When the nurse came in with a fresh pot of coffee, I stood and took the cup from her. The steam curled into the air, warm and fleeting. I placed it on the table beside his bed, next to the folder that contained everything he'd hidden and everything he was ready to face. It's not about who pours Dad. It's about why. He looked at the cup, then up at me. His lips trembled into a small, genuine smile. His eyes shone with tears he didn't try to hide. The first rays of morning slipped through the blinds, painting his face in light. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who had hurt me, but as the man who was finally trying to understand me. I took one last look at him, then turned toward the door. My steps were slow, deliberate, light. I felt like I could finally breathe again. Behind me, the monitor continued its steady rhythm. The soft hum of the machines mingled with the faint hiss of the coffee cooling beside him. When I reached the hallway, I glanced back once. The sunlight had filled the room completely, catching the thin trail of steam rising from the cup. It looked almost like forgiveness made visible something fragile, fleeting, but real. And for the first time in my life, I let it go. 3 weeks after the gala, the echoes of that night had softened into silence. But silence doesn't mean peace. It's just the space left behind when the noise dies. I stood in front of the Senate committee palms, flat on the wooden podium, the official seal behind me gleaming under the harsh lights. Cameras lined the back of the hall, journalists waiting for the name they wanted me to say. The words on the first page of my report blurred slightly before I began. Impact of industrial pollution on veteran health. My voice was steady, trained from years of keeping it that way, but my pulse hammered beneath the table. I didn't mention any names. Not the company, not the man who built it, not the man who finally broke it. I only said what mattered. We cannot heal soldiers while poisoning the water they come home to. A wave of whispers rippled through the chamber. The microphones caught every syllable, the news cycle already hungry to twist it. But I refused to give them the blood they wanted. The truth didn't need a villain to stand, it only needed to stand. When the session adjourned, I walked past a sea of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions, each one louder, sharper, more desperate. Was it Robinson Energy? Are you confirming your father's involvement? I kept walking. Honor doesn't need victims to exist. That evening, the story broke anyway. The truth always finds its way out, even when you don't give it permission. My father had signed over the entire company, every asset, every holding, to a new foundation called the Veterans Green Trust. It wasn't my doing. He had made the arrangements himself from his hospital bed. The board, the lawyers, the papers all filed and executed in silence. By morning, the headlines had shifted tone. Industrial giant becomes philanthropic pioneer. They called him a visionary, a redeemer. The same people who had feasted on his downfall now praised him for his courage. I didn't correct them. Maybe this was how redemption worked, messy, incomplete, misunderstood. That night I was still awake when my phone rang. Lydia's voice came through the line, hoarse and trembling. He was smiling, Ethel, just smiling. The world went still. When I reached the hospital, dawn hadn't yet arrived. The corridors were half lit, the smell of antiseptic faint, but familiar. His door was open. Inside, the machines had already been turned off. No tubes, no wires, just him lying quietly in the dim light. His hand rested on the blanket, fingers still curled, as if holding on to something unseen. I sat beside him for a long time. The air was cool, the stillness complete. On the bedside table sat the same cup of coffee. I'd left him days ago, now cold, a faint ring of brown staining the white porcelain. It smelled faintly of burnt roast and peace. He looked different, in death lighter somehow. The lines around his mouth were gone, the tension erased. There was no grandeur, no arrogance, no armor, just a man who had finally stopped fighting himself. The nurse who'd been on duty handed me a small envelope she'd found in the drawer beside his bed. My name was written across the front, the letters uneven, trembling. I waited until I was alone before opening it. Inside was a single page folded once. The ink was smudged in places where the pen must have hesitated. I mocked what I feared. You made me proud long before I said it. Honor isn't inherited, it's chosen every day. Thank you for teaching me how. The paper blurred. I felt tears slide down my cheeks, soft and hot, falling onto the words, and spreading the ink into pale blue clouds. I pressed the letter to my chest, the edges trembling against my heartbeat. Finally, I whispered almost to the air itself. Finally, Dad. The first light of morning crept through the window blinds, painting the room in pale gold. It touched the corner of the letter, making the ink glisten fragile and alive. I looked at his still face one last time and understood what peace looked like. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand an audience, it simply existed. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into my coat pocket, and stood. The nurse entered quietly to collect his chart, her eyes downcast. I nodded once, unable to speak. As I walked out the corridor, filled with early sunlight, soft and forgiving. Behind me, the wind from the half-open window stirred the curtains. The letter in my pocket rustled faintly, almost like a breath. Outside Denver was waking up. The city that had witnessed his humiliation now carried his redemption on its morning headlines. But for me, it wasn't about the news or the company or the applause. It was about a man who had finally chosen to be better, and a daughter who had finally stopped needing him to be anything more. The sun climbed higher, and a single beam of light slipped through the glass landing on my shoulder as I stepped out of the hospital doors. The chill of the night faded, replaced by a quiet warmth. Behind me, through the window, the letter fluttered on the table beside his bed, catching the morning breeze. The words shimmered faintly, as if alive one last time, before settling back into stillness. Honor, I thought, is never inherited. It's built one choice at a time, and sometimes it's found in the silence they leave behind. Spring morning settled over Red Creek like a breath held and released. The air was bright and clean, washed new by the rain that had fallen through the night. Beyond the foothills, sunlight spread across the valley, glinting off the fresh glass of the new building that bore my father's name, Robinson Health for Veterans. The ceremony was already underway when I stepped outside. A line of flags rippled in the wind, the largest one, red, white, and blue, casting its shadow over the crowd. Veterans in faded uniforms, nurses, and young doctors stood together, their laughter and quiet pride mingling with the rustle of spring leaves. These people weren't colleagues to me anymore. They were family born not of blood, but of service. I wore my white coat for the occasion, the same one I'd worn during my last night at the hospital with him. The morning breeze tugged at its hem, brushing it against my legs, as if to remind me how far I'd come. Behind me, a statue stood where the first beam of sunlight always touched the courtyard. Bronze and solemn, the figure was unmistakable. Harold Robinson, he learned to serve. The words etched into the base gleamed faintly, catching the morning light. It wasn't a monument to perfection. It wasn't meant to erase the damage or the mistakes. It was there because he had tried. Because in the end, he had learned the one lesson money could never buy. Lydia walked up quietly. Her hair pinned back. Her expression gentler than I'd seen in years. In her hands, she held a small wooden frame. She smiled faintly as she handed it to me. He'd want this here. The photo inside was simple, him sitting in his hospital bed, coffee cup in hand, sunlight across his face. No suit, no mask, just him human. I ran my thumb across the edge of the frame, then placed it on the pedestal beside the flagpole where the wind could touch it. For a long moment, I stood there, watching the flag whip against the sky, its edges catching light like fire. The crowd's murmurs faded into background hum. A young man stepped closer, a veteran barely older than I'd been when I left home. His uniform was neatly pressed, his medals small but shining. Dr. Robinson, he asked, his voice hesitant but curious. Was he proud of you? The question hung between us, light but heavy all at once. I turned toward the flag, letting the wind lift the hair from my face. For a heartbeat, I saw my father's reflection in the gleam of the bronze statue, the way he used to stand unyielding. And then I remembered the last time I saw him smile. He learned to be, I said, and smiled back at the young man. The band began to play softly, the murmur of conversation fading as I stepped up to the podium. The microphone caught the wind, carrying the sound of flags snapping overhead. I looked over the faces gathered before me, men and women who had seen loss, endurance, forgiveness. When I began to speak, my voice came out steadier than I expected. My father once thought my paycheck defined me. Now his legacy reminds me that service defines us all. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind that comes from people who understand, who've lived enough life to know the weight of change. The ceremony ended quietly. Guests drifted toward the building, shaking hands, trading stories. The new center's glass facade caught the sunlight, scattering it like shards of morning across the courtyard. When the last of them had gone inside, I stayed behind. The wind off the valley had picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth. The flag above me flared against the sky, fierce and unbroken. I walked to the base of the statue, my steps soft against the stone. From the pocket of my coat, I pulled out the old medic badge, the one that had followed me from the sand of Kandahar to the sterile lights of Denver. The metal was dull now, worn smooth by time and by my hands. I crouched and set it gently beneath his photograph. The badge caught the sunlight for a moment, a single spark of silver before settling into shadow. "We're both free now, Dad." The words came out as a whisper, carried away almost immediately by the wind. But I didn't need anyone else to hear them. He would. Somehow he would. The glass doors behind me reflected the flag, the statue, and the building, all in one frame, three symbols of what had been broken and built again. The morning light moved higher, spilling warmth over everything it touched. For a long moment I stayed there, letting it reach me too. The breeze shifted gentler now. It caught the edge of the flag and sent it unfurling wide, a wave of red, white, and blue across the pale sky. The badge gleamed once more, and I realized that for the first time in years, the weight I'd carried, his expectations, his absence, my anger was gone. The sunlight poured through the glass of the new center, spreading across the courtyard, over the statue, and onto the steps where I stood. It wrapped the photo of my father and the old badge beneath it in the same golden light, merging the past and the present into something almost holy. When I finally turned to leave, the reflection on the windows followed me, a woman in white walking beneath a flag that refused to fall. And for the first time, I didn't look back.